She was certain she was carrying the savior of Catholic England. But what was really growing inside her was something far more terrifying. In 1558, Queen Mary I lay dying, her belly swollen like a late-term pregnancy. Courtiers whispered about a miracle heir. Physicians swore they could feel movement. Yet no child was ever born. What they should have feared wasn't a royal baby, but the silent disease that had been eating her alive for years. If you want more true Tudor nightmares, the history books tried to soften. Stay, watch till the end, and quietly join the court by subscribing. September 1554. Mary Tudor was 38 years old when her monthly bleeding stopped. For most women, this would signal the twilight of fertility. But for England's first queen regnant, it meant something else entirely. Hope. She had married Philip of Spain only 2 months earlier in a union designed to restore Catholic dominance across Europe. Now her body was transforming. Her breasts swelled and grew tender. Waves of nausea struck her each morning. Her belly began to curve outward, stretching the fabric of her gowns. Every symptom pointed to one miraculous conclusion. Mary was pregnant. The news electrified the kingdom. Parliament immediately passed the Treason Act, naming Philip as regent should Mary die in childbirth. It was a dangerous time to bring royal children into the world. Mothers died. Babies died. The throne hung in the balance with every labor pain. By December, Hampton Court Palace buzzed with preparations. Servants aired out the royal birthing chambers, hanging thick tapestries to block drafts. Midwives were summoned from across the country. Cradles were carved from oak and lined with silk. The Catholic Restoration depended on this child. England's future depended on this child. Mary felt the baby move. At least, she believed she did. Flutters in her abdomen that she interpreted as tiny limbs stretching inside her womb. Physicians confirmed it. Her ladies-in-waiting placed their hands on her belly and swore they felt it too. Everyone saw what they wanted to see. April 30th, 1555. Church bells erupted across London. Bonfires blazed in the streets. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates, cheering and weeping with joy. The news spread like wildfire. Queen Mary had given birth to a son, a Catholic prince, an heir to secure the dynasty. Except it was all a lie. No baby existed. No infant cried in the royal nursery. The rumors had outpaced reality, fueled by desperation and wishful thinking. Inside Hampton Court, the truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Mary had entered her confinement in late April, retreating to a darkened chamber as tradition demanded. Pregnant queens withdrew from public life in their final weeks, surrounded only by female attendants. The room was sealed, curtains drawn, candles burning day and night. It was supposed to be a sacred space where life entered the world. Instead, it became a prison. Weeks passed. Then a month. Her attendants grew alarmed. Mary barely ate. She seemed detached from reality, her mood swinging between euphoria and crushing despair. Some whispered she was losing her mind. Others feared malnutrition would kill the child before it could be born. But there was no child. By July, her swollen abdomen had begun to shrink. The movements she had felt ceased. Her physicians had no explanation. Tudor medicine could diagnose a fever or set a broken bone, but this was beyond their understanding. They watched helplessly as the pregnancy that never was simply dissolved. The Venetian ambassador, Giovanni Miceli, wrote a cruel assessment in his report back to Venice. He suggested the Queen's condition would likely end in wind rather than anything else. The mockery stung, but he wasn't wrong. In August, the court quietly relocated to Oatlands Palace. The official reason was to clean Hampton Court after months of occupancy. The real reason was shame. Mary needed to escape the rooms that had been prepared for a child who would never exist. The cradles were dismantled, the tapestries taken down, the midwives sent home. England's Catholic heir had vanished like morning mist. And deep inside Mary's body, something far darker had already begun to grow. 2 years passed. Mary tried to forget the humiliation, but her body wouldn't let her. In 1557, the symptoms returned. Her monthly cycles had never resumed after the first episode. Now her abdomen began swelling again, larger and faster than before. This time, the sensation was different, heavier, more painful, and it refused to go away. Mary convinced herself it was happening again. Another chance, another pregnancy. God was giving her a second opportunity to secure a Catholic heir and prove her doubters wrong. She had to believe it because the alternative was unthinkable. But those closest to her saw something alarming. This wasn't like the first time. Her belly distended to grotesque proportions, the skin stretched tight and shining. She complained of sharp pains that radiated through her torso. When she lay down, the mass shifted unnaturally inside her, creating movements she interpreted as a child kicking. Her breasts produced milk. Not just tenderness or swelling, but actual lactation. Drops of fluid that soaked through her undergarments. To Mary, this was proof. Her body was preparing to nurse the prince or princess who would restore England to Rome's embrace. The court said nothing. What could they say? Contradict the queen and risk her wrath? Pretend to believe her and face mockery when the truth emerged? So they existed in uncomfortable silence, watching Mary's body betray her in ways no one could explain. Months dragged on. Unlike the first phantom pregnancy, this swelling persisted through 1557 and into 1558. It grew. It hardened. Mary could barely move under the weight of it. Simple tasks like climbing stairs left her breathless and dizzy. The pain became constant, a dull ache that sharpened into stabbing agony without warning. She stopped appearing in public. Audiences were canceled. State business fell to her advisors. Philip, her husband, had long since returned to Spain and showed no interest in coming back. She was alone with whatever was consuming her from the inside. By the summer of 1558, even Mary couldn't maintain the illusion. No due date could be stretched this far. No pregnancy lasted over a year. The movements continued, but they weren't the gentle flutters of an infant. They were something else, something wrong. In August, she traveled from Hampton Court to Westminster, then to St. James's Palace. At the base of the stairs, her lady-in-waiting Jane Dormer greeted her, having recently recovered from the influenza epidemic sweeping through London. Mary asked if Jane was well now. Jane smiled and confirmed she was healthy again. Mary's response was quiet, almost resigned. "So am not I." Those 4 words carried the weight of someone who knew they were dying, but couldn't admit it aloud. She climbed the stairs to her private chambers, and the door closed behind her. She would never leave that room alive. Inside that locked chamber, Mary's physicians could only watch and record. Dr. Thomas Hick, her royal physician, documented symptoms that defied every medical text of the era. The observations he preserved would puzzle doctors for centuries. Her fevers came in cycles. Days of burning heat followed by brief periods of relief. Then the fire would return without warning. Her skin grew clammy, then dry, then soaked with sweat that stained the bedsheets. The pattern made no sense. Depression settled over her like fog. She would lie motionless for hours, staring at nothing, responding to no one. Then suddenly she'd become agitated, demanding answers about her condition that no physician could provide. The mood swings were violent and unpredictable. Her headaches were catastrophic. She described them as hammers striking behind her eyes, pressure building inside her skull until she thought it might split open. Servants kept the room dark and silent, but even candlelight made her wince in agony. Then her vision began to fail. It started with blurriness at the edges. Objects became difficult to focus on. Colors faded to muted grays. By October, she could barely distinguish faces across the room. Jane Dormer had to lean close just so Mary could recognize her. The Queen of England was going blind, and no one knew why. Her skin turned yellow. Jaundice crept across her face and hands, a sickly hue that marked internal organs shutting down. Tudor physicians recognized this as a death sign. Whatever was happening inside her body had spread beyond the swollen mass in her abdomen. Dr. Hick consulted with Thomas Wendy, another royal physician. Together, they compiled their diagnosis using the only framework available to 16th century medicine: quartan ague, a type of recurring fever; amenorrhea, the absence of monthly bleeding; and the most obvious symptom, the grotesquely swollen abdomen that had convinced everyone she was pregnant. But they had no concept of tumors, no understanding of cancer, no framework for cells multiplying out of control and consuming healthy tissue from within. The word tumor existed in Latin, meaning swelling, but they couldn't comprehend what we know today as malignant growth. They bled her, applied leeches to draw out bad humors, fed her herbal concoctions that did nothing but upset her stomach further, prayed over her bedside, because prayer was often the most powerful medicine they possessed. Nothing worked. The physicians recorded everything meticulously, their notes preserved in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians. Detailed accounts of a medical mystery they couldn't solve. A queen dying before their eyes while they stood helpless, armed only with medieval knowledge against a disease that wouldn't be understood for another 300 years. All they could do was bear witness to her suffering and wait for the inevitable end. While her physicians struggled to name what was killing her, the rest of Mary's world quietly began to dissolve. The court understood something long before anyone dared to admit it aloud. This queen was not recovering. The swelling wasn't receding. Her strength wasn't returning. Every week, fewer footsteps echoed in the galleries outside her chamber. Ambitious courtiers, nobles, even servants began to drift away from St. James's and toward Hatfield, where Elizabeth waited like a rising star on the edge of the storm. In Tudor England, loyalty bent toward survival. Inside Mary's rooms, the atmosphere changed. The bustle of attendance thinned to a handful of familiar faces. Jane Dormer remained, moving silently between bed, fire, and door, the constant presence in a space that had grown oppressively still. The great business of state slipped from Mary's hands and into those of counselors who were already thinking about the next reign. Messages were carried in and out, but fewer required her signature. Decisions were delayed. Some were simply ignored. Philip did not return. The man she had loved and married for the sake of dynasty stayed in Spain, occupied with wars and politics. Letters arrived occasionally, formal and distant. Whatever comfort she might have imagined in a husband's presence never came. In the final months, Mary was surrounded by symbols of her queenship cloth of gold, carved bedposts, the royal arms on the wall, yet increasingly cut off from real power, real companionship, real hope. As her condition worsened, the rituals of monarchy took on a hollow tone. Prayers were ordered for her health across the kingdom, but inside the palace, conversations turned to what would happen after she was gone. Some counselors quietly made contact with Elizabeth, hedging their bets. Others ensured that documents were in order, revenues accounted for, alliances prepared to shift. Mary's body was failing, and the machinery of rule was already adjusting around that fact. To the Queen, the change must have been obvious. Fewer visitors, shorter audiences, faces she had seen daily, now gone without explanation. She had once presided over crowded halls and glittering ceremonies. Now her world narrowed to the bed, the window, the handful of loyal women who refused to abandon her. The isolation amplified everything, the pain, the fear, the creeping sense that she had been left behind by the very people she had fought to govern. By late summer, one reality was impossible to escape. There would be no child to inherit her crown. Whatever had mimicked pregnancy had instead stripped her of the one thing that could have secured her legacy. England's future no longer pointed toward a Catholic son or daughter, but toward the Protestant half-sister she had so often regarded with suspicion. As Mary lay there, weakened and nearly blind, the kingdom she had tried to reshape was already tilting toward a different fate. In that dim, guarded room, the abandonment was quiet, almost polite. No revolt, no open defiance. Just a steady turning away, a polite retreat toward the next sun on the horizon. And Mary, caught between private agony and public failure, was left to face both alone. Centuries after Mary's death, doctors began asking the question her own physicians couldn't. What was actually growing inside her? The first attempt at a posthumous diagnosis came in 1877, when Dr. T. Spencer Wells proposed a theory that would haunt medical literature for generations. He believed Mary had died from ovarian cancer, a silent killer that could explain nearly every symptom she endured. Over a century later, Dr. Victor Cornelius Medvay took up the investigation. As president of the section of the history of medicine, he had access to archives, royal records, and centuries of accumulated medical knowledge. In 1987, he published a comprehensive analysis that meticulously traced Mary's symptoms against what modern oncology understood about ovarian and uterine malignancies. The evidence was chilling in its clarity. Ovarian cancer often begins quietly. A woman might feel bloating, mild discomfort, nothing alarming enough to seek help in an era when pain was simply endured. But beneath the surface, abnormal cells multiply, forming masses that grow slowly at first, then accelerate. These tumors can swell with fluid, creating what Tudor doctors would have called dropsy, a grotesque distension of the abdomen that mimics late pregnancy. Mary's swelling fit this pattern perfectly. It appeared gradually, increased over months, and never receded the way a phantom pregnancy should. The mass grew so large, it restricted her movement and breathing. Fluid accumulated in her abdominal cavity, a condition called ascites, making her belly tight and unnaturally round. The pain she described matches what we know of advanced ovarian cancer: dull aches that sharpen without warning, pressure against other organs, a constant grinding discomfort that no position or remedy can ease. As the tumor expands, it can press on the intestines, bladder, and spine, creating agony that radiates through the entire torso. Then there's the jaundice. When Mary's skin turned yellow in her final weeks, it signaled that cancer had metastasized to her liver. Ovarian cancer spreads through the abdominal cavity with devastating efficiency, seeding itself on the liver, intestines, and peritoneum. Once it reaches the liver, the organ begins to fail, unable to process toxins from the blood. Jaundice appears. Weakness follows. Death comes quickly after. By 2010, researchers at the Royal College of Physicians reviewed every scrap of historical evidence and reached a grim consensus. Mary Tudor most likely died from ovarian cancer that had spread to her liver. The timeline fit, the symptoms aligned. Even the rapid deterioration in her final months matched the aggressive progression of metastatic disease. But there was a problem. Without physical evidence, without tissue samples or skeletal remains, it remained an educated guess. Dr. Medvay himself acknowledged the limitation. In his words, the only way to obtain proof would be to open Queen Mary's coffin and examine her remains with modern imaging technology. That has never happened. Mary lies buried in Westminster Abbey, sharing a vault with her half-sister Elizabeth. Her body has never been exhumed, never studied, never subjected to the autopsy that might finally answer the question. So ovarian cancer remains a theory, a likely theory, a compelling theory, but still just a theory. Then, in the year 2000, a different explanation emerged that would challenge everything. Dr. Milo Keynes published a groundbreaking paper in the Journal of Medical Biography that proposed something radical. What if the cancer diagnosis was incomplete? What if Mary's phantom pregnancies, her blindness, her decades of suffering, all pointed to a single hidden culprit buried deep inside her skull? He called it a prolactinoma, a tumor of the pituitary gland. The pituitary is a pea-sized organ that sits behind the bridge of the nose, nestled beneath the brain. Despite its tiny size, it controls nearly every hormone in the human body. When a tumor grows there, even a benign one, the consequences ripple through every system. The gland begins overproducing prolactin, the hormone responsible for milk production and reproductive cycles. Dr. Keynes realized this could explain what ovarian cancer couldn't, why Mary's body so convincingly mimicked pregnancy. Excess prolactin floods the bloodstream and tricks the body into believing it's pregnant or nursing. Menstruation stops completely. Breasts swell and begin lactating. Weight accumulates around the abdomen. Nausea strikes in waves. The sensation of movement inside the belly, caused by shifting fluids and intestinal contractions, feels exactly like a baby kicking. Mary wasn't delusional. Her body was genuinely responding to hormonal signals that screamed pregnancy, even though no child existed. But prolactinomas don't just disrupt reproduction. As the tumor expands inside the narrow space of the skull, it presses against surrounding structures. The optic nerve runs directly beside the pituitary gland. When a tumor grows large enough, it crushes the nerve, causing progressive vision loss, blurriness, tunnel vision, eventually near total blindness. Mary went blind in her final months. Ovarian cancer doesn't cause that. A pituitary tumor does. Dr. Keynes found more evidence in Mary's portraits. A painting from 1554, when she was 38, shows subtle but unmistakable signs of hormonal dysfunction. Her eyebrows are sparse, almost missing. Her face appears puffy and flushed. Her hairline has receded. These aren't natural effects of aging. They're symptoms of thyroid malfunction caused by pituitary disruption. Contemporary accounts described her voice as deep and rough, her skin pale and thickened, her digestion chronically poor. She suffered relentless headaches that felt like her skull was being crushed from the inside. All classic indicators of a growing brain tumor pressing against delicate tissue. The timeline fit eerily well. Mary had suffered irregular menstruation and mysterious illnesses since adolescence. By her 20s, she was writing to advisors about migraines, insomnia, and inexplicable pain. These weren't separate conditions. They were early warnings of a tumor that had been growing slowly for decades. By the time she reached her 30s, the prolactinoma had grown large enough to destabilize her entire endocrine system. It caused the phantom pregnancies. It stole her vision. It may have even caused the mental confusion and depression that plagued her final years, as the expanding mass pressed against her brain. And unlike cancer, which kills through metastasis, a pituitary tumor kills through pressure. It doesn't need to spread. It just needs to grow large enough to crush the structures that keep you alive. Dr. Keynes believed this was the true answer. Not ovarian cancer. A tumor hidden behind her eyes, silently destroying her from within. But what if both diagnoses were correct? Dr. Medvay, after years of comparing symptom lists and medical theories, arrived at a conclusion that was both elegant and horrifying. Mary Tudor didn't suffer from one disease. She suffered from several, each feeding into the others, creating a cascade of medical disasters that 16th century medicine had no hope of understanding. The pituitary tumor came first. It likely began growing in her adolescence, explaining the menstrual irregularities and chronic pain she endured from her teenage years onward. As it expanded through her 20s and 30s, it slowly poisoned her hormonal system, causing the headaches, vision problems, and reproductive chaos that doctors attributed to stress or ill treatment by her father. But a brain tumor alone doesn't explain the massive abdominal swelling that dominated her final years. That points to something else growing simultaneously: ovarian cysts or malignant tumors in her reproductive organs. The two conditions weren't competing diagnoses, they were partners in destruction. The prolactinoma disrupted her ovulation and menstrual cycles, creating an environment where ovarian cysts could develop unchecked. Without regular hormonal cycling, the ovaries can form fluid-filled sacs that grow to enormous size. In some cases, these cysts turn cancerous. The constant hormonal imbalance from the brain tumor may have actually triggered the ovarian disease. Add to this the possibility of endometriosis, a condition where uterine tissue grows outside the uterus, causing chronic pelvic pain and inflammation. Mary complained of severe abdominal pain from her youth. Endometriosis often goes undiagnosed for years, and in the Tudor era, it would have been completely invisible to physicians. So picture this: a woman with a brain tumor pressing on her optic nerve and flooding her body with prolactin. Ovarian masses swelling with fluid and possibly cancerous cells. Endometrial tissue growing wildly through her abdomen, causing constant pain. All three conditions existing at once, each making the others worse. The prolactinoma convinced her body it was pregnant. The ovarian masses created the physical swelling that seemed to confirm it. The endometriosis added layers of pain that made every movement agony. And when the ovarian tumors metastasized to her liver, they brought the final chapter: jaundice, organ failure, death. Modern consensus among medical historians leans toward this compound diagnosis. Mary wasn't killed by one disease. She was killed by several, all attacking different parts of her body simultaneously, creating symptoms so complex and contradictory that even today, with centuries of medical advancement, we struggle to untangle them. There is one more factor to consider: the influenza epidemic of 1558. The same illness that Jane Dormer recovered from swept through England that summer and fall. For someone already weakened by tumors, cancer, and chronic pain, influenza could have been the final blow. A healthy person survives the flu. Someone with Mary's compromised immune system and failing organs doesn't stand a chance. The truth is likely that Mary died from everything at once. Not one killer, but a coalition of diseases that converged in the worst possible way. Her body became a battlefield where multiple conditions fought for dominance, and in the end, they all won. She never stood a chance. The tragedy of Mary Tudor's death isn't that it came suddenly. It's that it announced itself for decades, and no one recognized the warnings. Her suffering began long before she ever wore a crown. As a teenager, Mary's menstrual cycles were irregular and painful, accompanied by bouts of illness that left her bedridden for weeks at a time. Royal physicians attributed it to her emotional distress. Her father had just annulled his marriage to her mother and declared Mary illegitimate. Heartbreak and political trauma made convenient explanations for symptoms they couldn't otherwise understand. By 1536, when she was 20 years old, the pain had become constant. Under intense pressure from Henry VIII and his minister Thomas Cromwell to submit to her father as authority, Mary wrote desperate letters describing crushing headaches, throbbing toothaches that radiated through her jaw, and nerve pain that made sleep impossible. The treatments were medieval and brutal: teeth extracted without anesthesia, veins opened to drain blood from her foot and arms, leeches applied to draw out imagined poisons. The bloodletting likely caused chronic anemia, leaving her pale, weak, and constantly exhausted. But Tudor medicine believed bad blood caused illness, so they kept draining it, never realizing they were making everything worse. In December 1537, and again in January 1538, she fell so severely ill that her household feared she would die. She was only 21 years old. Whatever was growing inside her had already taken root. Throughout the 1540s and into the 1550s, the symptoms never truly left. They would fade for a while, giving her brief windows of relative health, then return with renewed intensity. Headaches, digestive problems, waves of depression so profound she could barely function. Her ladies-in-waiting learned to recognize the patterns, but no physician could offer more than temporary relief. When Mary finally became queen in 1553 at age 37, she was already a woman worn down by decades of undiagnosed disease. The portraits from 1554 captured physical changes that only make sense in hindsight: the missing eyebrows, the puffy face, the receding hairline. Her body was trying to show what words couldn't explain. Then came the phantom pregnancies, the final desperate hope that turned into public humiliation. By May 1558, she was too weak to rise from bed for more than a few hours. The court saw a dying woman and began preparing for her successor. August brought her final journey to St. James's Palace and the chamber she would never leave. October 28th, she summoned physician Thomas Wendy to witness a codicil to her will, one of her last conscious acts of governance. November 17th, 1558. Mary Tudor died at 42, blind and in agony, her body destroyed by diseases that had been quietly killing her since adolescence. The timeline reveals a haunting truth. This wasn't a sudden illness that struck a healthy queen. This was a slow execution that took 27 years to complete. From age 15 to 42, Mary lived in near constant pain, treated by doctors who had no framework to understand what was happening, let alone stop it. Her body had been screaming the truth for decades. But in the 16th century, no one knew how to listen. Mary's body didn't just fail her. It failed an entire kingdom. If the pituitary tumor caused her infertility, if the ovarian disease made conception impossible, if the decades of hormonal chaos destroyed any chance she had of bearing a child, that a microscopic growth behind her eyes changed the course of English history more decisively than any battle or treaty ever could. She married Philip of Spain specifically to produce a Catholic heir. The entire strategy of her reign depended on it. Restore the old religion, repair ties with Rome, marry a powerful Catholic prince, and birth a son who would inherit both England and eventually Spain's vast empire. That child would have secured Catholic dominance across Europe for generations. Instead, her womb remained empty, and when she died without an heir, the crown passed to Elizabeth. Protestant Elizabeth, who had spent years under suspicion and house arrest, who Mary had at times considered executing as a threat to the throne. Elizabeth, who would spend the next 45 years systematically dismantling everything Mary had built. The religious settlement Mary fought for disappeared within months of her death. Catholic bishops were removed. Protestant clergy returned from exile. England's break with Rome became permanent. All because Mary's body couldn't do the one thing 16th century queens were expected to do: produce a male heir. The phantom pregnancies created constitutional crises that paralyzed the government. When Mary believed she was pregnant in 1555, Parliament passed the Treason Act naming Philip as regent if she died in childbirth. Political factions formed around the question of Spanish influence over England. Ambassadors wrote anxious dispatches to foreign courts about succession uncertainties. The entire apparatus of government held its breath, waiting for a child that would never come. During the first false pregnancy, Elizabeth was summoned to Hampton Court and confined to the prince's lodgings. She wasn't allowed to leave. Mary needed Elizabeth close in case the birth went badly, but also wanted her under watch. For weeks, Elizabeth lived in limbo, half prisoner and half presumptive heir, while her sister waited for a baby that didn't exist. When the pregnancy failed, Elizabeth was released, but the succession remained unresolved. Mary was in her late 30s. If she couldn't produce an heir, England would eventually pass to a Protestant. Catholic courtiers who had bet their careers on Mary's dynasty faced ruin. The second phantom pregnancy brought even more desperation. By 1557, Mary was running out of time. She was 41. If this pregnancy also failed, and it did, there would be no more chances. No Catholic prince, no restoration secured, just the grim certainty that her Protestant half-sister would inherit everything. When Mary finally died in November 1558, the transition happened with stunning speed. Elizabeth was proclaimed queen the same day. Within hours, courtiers who had served Mary were bending the knee to Elizabeth. The Catholic experiment was over, and it ended not because of rebellion or invasion, but because tumors growing inside Mary's body made childbirth impossible. Biology determined theology. Medicine shaped monarchy. A disease no one could diagnose or treat rewrote the religious map of Europe. England would never be Catholic again, and Mary's failure to produce an heir was the reason why. 27 years. That's how long Mary Tudor lived with diseases that no one could name. From age 15, when the first mysterious symptoms appeared, until age 42, when she finally died, she existed in a state of chronic suffering that never fully released its grip. There were good days, certainly moments when the pain receded enough for her to govern, to appear at court, to maintain the carefully constructed image of royal authority. But the relief was always temporary. The shadow always returned. Imagine living that way, waking each morning uncertain whether today would bring crushing headaches or merely dull ones, whether your vision would hold or blur into uselessness, whether the pain in your abdomen would be bearable or so intense you couldn't stand upright. Every day for nearly 3 decades, not knowing which version of suffering awaited you. Tudor medicine had nothing to offer but rituals that often caused more harm than relief. Bloodletting weakened her further, draining the very vitality she needed to fight whatever was consuming her from within. Tooth extractions removed healthy teeth in the mistaken belief that infection in the mouth caused her headaches. Herbal mixtures upset her stomach without addressing the underlying causes. Prayer was offered with genuine faith, but prayer doesn't shrink tumors or stop cancer from spreading. Her physicians weren't incompetent. They were working with the limited knowledge of their era, doing the best they could with tools that were utterly inadequate for the task. They could set bones, treat wounds, identify some fevers. But they had no understanding of hormones, no concept of endocrine systems, no framework for recognizing how a tiny tumor in the brain could create chaos throughout the entire body. If Mary had lived in the 20th century instead of the 16th, her story would have ended differently. A simple blood test could have detected the hormonal imbalances caused by a pituitary tumor. An MRI scan would have revealed the mass behind her eyes within minutes. Surgery could have removed it, or medication could have shrunk it, restoring her vision and ending the phantom pregnancies before they humiliated her. Ovarian cysts, even large ones, can be surgically removed today. Cancer, if caught early enough, can be treated with combinations of surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation that didn't exist in Mary's world. Endometriosis, once a mystery, now has treatments that manage pain and preserve fertility. She could have lived. She could have been healthy. She could have had the children she desperately wanted, or at least been spared the cruel mockery of her body, pretending to carry them. But she was born 5 centuries too early. So instead, she endured 27 years of unrelenting pain, treated by doctors who could observe but not heal, who could record symptoms but not cure them. Her suffering was documented meticulously in medical texts and royal archives, every detail preserved for future doctors to study. But for Mary herself, that documentation meant nothing. It didn't ease the headaches. It didn't restore her sight. It didn't save her life. She died the way she had lived, in pain, without answers, abandoned by a medical system that simply didn't know enough to help her. When Mary Tudor died on November 17, 1558, her body was prepared for burial according to royal tradition. It was washed, wrapped in cerecloth, sealed in a lead coffin, and placed inside a wooden outer case. No autopsy was performed. No examination of her internal organs. No investigation into what had caused the swelling, the blindness, the years of agony. In Tudor England, royal bodies were sacred. The idea of cutting open a queen to study her innards would have been unthinkable, bordering on sacrilege. So Mary was sealed away with all her secrets still inside her, and the chance to understand what killed her was buried alongside her bones. She lies in Westminster Abbey, in the same vault as Elizabeth. 2 half-sisters who spent their lives in opposition, united in death beneath a single monument. The inscription reads simply that they rest in hope of resurrection. but their coffins have never been opened. Their remains have never been studied. The physical evidence that could definitively answer centuries of medical speculation is locked beneath marble and stone, untouchable. Dr. Medvay acknowledged this limitation when he published his analysis in 1987. He wrote that the only way to obtain real proof would be to exhume Mary's body and examine her skull with modern imaging technology. X-rays could reveal whether a pituitary tumor had eroded the bone around the sella turcica, the small depression where the gland sits. CT scans could show evidence of skeletal changes caused by hormonal imbalances. But that examination has never happened. There is no political will to disturb the grave of a Tudor queen for the sake of medical curiosity. So the question remains permanently unanswered, frozen in the realm of theory rather than fact. What we have instead are fragments. Wax death masks were created after Mary died, a common practice for royalty. Modern doctors have analyzed these masks, looking for facial asymmetries or swelling patterns consistent with tumors. They found some suggestive features, but nothing conclusive. Portraits survive, particularly the one painted in 1554 when Mary was 38. Experts have studied her face for signs of endocrine dysfunction, the sparse eyebrows, the facial puffiness, the pallor. These details support the pituitary tumor theory, but they're not proof. Artists sometimes flattered their subjects or worked from descriptions rather than live sittings. Written testimony provides the most detailed evidence. Jane Dormer's account of Mary's final days was recorded and preserved. Physician notes from Dr. Thomas Hick and Thomas Wendy survived in the archives of the Royal College of Physicians. Letters Mary wrote describing her symptoms still exist in collections across England. These documents paint a vivid picture of her suffering, but their descriptions filtered through 16th century understanding. The words used don't map cleanly onto modern medical terminology. There are no tissue samples, no preserved organs in jars, no skeletal evidence beyond what might still exist inside her sealed coffin. Every diagnosis offered by modern doctors is reverse-engineered from incomplete historical records, educated guesswork based on symptom patterns and probability. The truth about what killed Mary Tudor died with her. It's sealed in lead, buried beneath Westminster Abbey, and protected by centuries of tradition that value the sanctity of royal graves over scientific inquiry. We can theorize, we can analyze, we can build compelling cases for pituitary tumors, or ovarian cancer, or both. But we cannot know, not with certainty, not without evidence that will almost certainly remain forever out of reach. Despite the missing evidence, medical historians have reached a fragile consensus built on probability rather than certainty. The majority lean toward a dual diagnosis, a pituitary tumor that began in adolescence, combined with ovarian disease that developed later and ultimately killed her. This explanation accounts for the widest range of symptoms across the longest timeline. It explains why she suffered from age 15 onward, why the phantom pregnancies felt so convincing, why she went blind, and why she died with massive abdominal swelling at 42. Dr. Milo Keynes made the strongest case for the prolactinoma in his 2000 paper. He argued that a pituitary tumor elegantly explains what other diagnoses cannot. The hormonal chaos that produced milk in her breasts stopped her menstruation for years and convinced her body it was carrying children that didn't exist. The progressive blindness seals it for him. That symptom points directly to a mass pressing on the optic nerve, and the pituitary gland sits in exactly the right location to cause that damage. Dr. Victor Cornelius Medvay, after exhaustive research published in 1987, agreed that prolactinoma was the most comprehensive explanation. But he also acknowledged that ovarian tumors likely contributed to her death, particularly given the jaundice and rapid decline in her final months. The Royal College of Physicians researchers, who reviewed the case in 2010, emphasized ovarian cancer with liver metastasis as the probable cause of death, while not ruling out the pituitary tumor as a contributing factor throughout her life. Dr. Emma Rees, a women's health specialist who examined the evidence in 2022, offered perhaps the most honest assessment. Given she lived 500 years ago and her chronicles were written by men, we will never really know. That uncertainty haunts every analysis. The symptoms fit multiple diagnoses. The timeline supports several theories. Without the ability to examine her remains, every conclusion remains tentative. Every expert opinion hedged with qualifiers and acknowledgments of missing data. What's clear is that Mary suffered from at least one serious, chronic, untreated condition. What's probable is that she suffered from several. What's certain is that 16th century medicine couldn't diagnose any of them, let alone treat them. Modern doctors can look back through the lens of centuries of accumulated knowledge and see patterns that Tudor physicians missed. They can identify hormonal disorders, recognize tumor symptoms, trace the progression of cancer. But even with all that expertise, they're still making educated guesses based on fragmentary evidence. The medical mystery of Mary Tudor remains unsolved not because doctors lack skill, but because the essential evidence is beyond reach. Her body holds the answers, sealed and laid beneath Westminster Abbey, protected by tradition and time from the examination that might finally end the debate. So the theories persist. Ovarian cancer, pituitary tumor, endometriosis, compound diagnosis, all plausible. None proven. The woman who wanted so desperately to be remembered for restoring Catholic England is instead remembered for a medical puzzle that has defied resolution for over 4 centuries. What was growing inside her? We can only guess. And perhaps that's the final cruelty. Even in death, Mary Tudor's suffering remains incompletely understood, her agony reduced to academic debate rather than definitive diagnosis. The truth died with her, and it will likely stay dead. The theories and diagnosis, the medical debates and scholarly papers, they all reduce Mary's death to symptoms and timelines. But inside that locked chamber at St. James's Palace, there was no diagnosis, only darkness. 3 months. That's how long she lingered between taking to her bed in late August and drawing her final breath in November. 90 days of slow deterioration, trapped in a body that was shutting down piece by piece. The room was kept dim. Light hurt her failing eyes, so heavy curtains blocked the windows. Candles were lit sparingly, their flames dancing shadows across walls she could barely see. The air grew stale from lack of circulation, thick with the smell of sweat and sickness, and the herb servants burned to mask it. She could no longer walk. When she needed to be moved, attendants lifted her carefully, supporting dead weight as she grimaced against pain that radiated from her swollen abdomen through her entire torso. Every shift in position brought fresh agony. Lying down pressed the mass against her spine. Sitting up made her dizzy and breathless. There was no comfortable position left. Food held no appeal. Her stomach rebelled against anything more than broth and watered wine. She was wasting away beneath the swelling, her arms and legs growing skeletal, while her belly remained grotesquely distended. The contradiction must have been disturbing to witness. A woman simultaneously starving and appearing heavily pregnant. Sleep came in fragments. The pain wouldn't let her rest for more than an hour or 2 before dragging her back to consciousness. Fever dreams blurred with waking thoughts. Sometimes she seemed lucid, asking about state business or inquiring after people at court. Other times she drifted, speaking to people who weren't there, reliving conversations from years past. Outside her chamber, England moved on without her. Council meetings happened without her input. Decisions were made and implemented without royal approval. The machinery of government had learned to function around her absence. She was queen in title, but the real power had already begun its migration toward Hatfield, where Elizabeth waited with carefully maintained patience. Letters arrived from Philip occasionally, formal correspondence that carried no warmth, no intimacy, no indication that he intended to return. He was busy with his wars in Europe, occupied with matters that mattered more than a dying wife in a distant kingdom. The marriage that was supposed to secure Catholic Europe had become a political embarrassment. Mary knew she was dying. There's no evidence she harbored illusions about recovery by this point. When she added the codicil to her will in late October, witnessed by physician Thomas Wendy, she was putting her affairs in order with the clarity of someone who understands time is running out. But knowing death is coming and experiencing its approach are different things. Each day brought fresh indignities. Her body betrayed her in ways both painful and humiliating. She required constant care for the most basic functions. The queen who had fought so hard for her throne, who had survived plots and rebellions and challenges to her legitimacy, was reduced to helplessness in a darkened room. And through it all, the question must have haunted her. What was this thing inside her? Why had God allowed her body to mimic pregnancy twice, raising hopes that were crushed with such cruel thoroughness? What sin had she committed to deserve this particular form of suffering? She would die without answers, but not yet. Not for another few weeks. First, she had to endure. While most of the court fled to safer, more promising futures, one young woman stayed. Jane Dormer was 19 years old when she watched her queen die. She had served Mary as a lady-in-waiting, a position that carried privilege and proximity to power. But in those final 3 months, it meant something else entirely, bearing witness to suffering that no amount of royal ceremony could dignify. Jane could have left. Others did, slipping away under various pretexts: illness, family obligations, urgent business elsewhere. The exodus was gradual enough to maintain appearances, but unmistakable in its meaning. By November, the once crowded royal apartments had emptied to a handful of attendants who either possessed uncommon loyalty or lacked better options. Jane stayed by choice. Day after day, she moved through the dim chamber, adjusting pillows that provided no comfort, offering food that wouldn't be eaten, maintaining routines that felt increasingly pointless except for the dignity they preserved. She watched Mary's face, once capable of fierce determination and queenly authority, become a mask of endurance. The conversations between them grew sparse. What was there to say? Mary knew she was dying. Jane knew it too. They existed together in that knowledge, sharing space in a room that had become separate from the rest of the world. There were moments of lucidity when Mary would speak about practical matters, instructions about her will, concerns about what would happen to her household after she was gone. Once, she asked Jane to ensure certain personal items reached specific people, small gestures of remembrance from a woman who understood she would soon be remembered primarily for failures. The most significant trust Mary placed in Jane involved her jewels. Royal jewelry carried both monetary and symbolic value, pieces that had adorned queens for generations. Mary entrusted these to Jane's care, with instructions to deliver them to Elizabeth after her death. It was a strange commission safeguarding treasures for the Protestant sister, who would inherit everything Mary had fought to prevent her from having. But Mary was practical, even in dying. Elizabeth would be queen. The jewels belonged to the crown, not to personal sentiment. So Jane accepted the responsibility, understanding she was being asked to serve as a bridge between two reigns, two sisters, two visions of England's future. What Jane witnessed in those months she would carry for the rest of her life. The physical deterioration was terrible enough. The jaundice, the blindness, the swelling that made movement torture. But there was also the emotional weight of watching someone die isolated and abandoned by most of those who had claimed loyalty. Years later, after Mary's death, Jane would marry Don Gomes Suarez de Figueroa, the Duke of Feria and Spanish ambassador. She would move to Spain and become a champion of exiled English Catholics, keeping alive the memories of a reign that England wanted to forget. In 1559, she fulfilled her final duty to Mary, delivering the jewels to Elizabeth at court. Elizabeth's ladies-in-waiting Blanche Parry, Lady Knowles, Marjorie Norris examined every piece with suspicious eyes, checking for missing stones or damages, treating Jane like a potential thief rather than a faithful servant who had honored her dead queen's wishes. Jane endured their scrutiny with the same quiet dignity she had shown in Mary's death chamber. She had promised. She had delivered. Her duty was complete. But the memories remained. And when she recorded her testimony years later, she gave history its most intimate glimpse into Mary Tudor's final days. Not the medical symptoms or political consequences, but the human reality of a woman dying alone, betrayed by her body and abandoned by her world. November 17th, 1558, early morning. The light outside was gray and cold, but Mary couldn't see it anymore. Her breathing had changed over the past few days. Shallow and irregular, punctuated by long pauses that made attendants lean closer, wondering if each breath would be the last. The fever that had come and gone for weeks now burned constant. Her skin, yellowed by jaundice, felt hot to the touch despite the autumn chill creeping through the palace walls. Jane Dormer and the remaining servants moved quietly around the chamber. There was nothing left to do medically. No treatments to administer. No remedies to try. They had exhausted every option Tudor medicine possessed. Now they could only wait and bear witness. Mary drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was awake, she seemed aware but distant, her mind perhaps already pulling away from a body that had caused her nothing but suffering. She spoke little. There were no grand final pronouncements, no deathbed speeches for the chroniclers to record. Just a woman too exhausted and pain-ridden for eloquence. The end came quietly. No dramatic final moment, no struggle. Her breathing simply grew fainter, the pauses between breaths longer, until finally the breathing stopped altogether. England's first queen regnant was dead at 42. The women in the room remained still for a moment, the silence somehow different, now that it wasn't interrupted by the sound of labored breathing. Then the practical necessities of death took over. The body needed to be prepared. Messages needed to be sent. Elizabeth needed to be informed that she was now queen. Mary's corpse was washed and wrapped according to royal custom. The grotesque swelling that had dominated her final years was still visible even in death, a permanent reminder of the mystery that had consumed her. Her face, finally at rest, showed the ravages of years of illness, the hollow cheeks, the pallor beneath the jaundice, the premature aging that suffering etches into flesh. She was placed in a lead coffin, sealed tight to preserve the remains. The coffin was then enclosed in a wooden case. No autopsy was performed. No examination of the masses that had grown inside her. The answers died with her, locked away in lead and ceremony. At Hatfield, Elizabeth received the news with carefully managed composure. She had been expecting it. The entire court had been expecting it. Within hours, she was proclaimed queen. The transition happened with remarkable speed, as if the kingdom had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Back at St. James's Palace, Jane Dormer gathered Mary's personal effects, including the jewels she had been entrusted to deliver. The chamber that had been a death room would be cleaned, aired out, and repurposed. Royal residences don't pause for grief. Mary Tudor, who had fought so hard to be queen, who had survived plots and rebellions, who had restored Catholicism and burned heretics, who had desperately wanted a child to secure her legacy, she was gone. And within months, everything she had built would be systematically dismantled by her successor. The woman who had believed she was carrying England's Catholic future had instead been carrying the tumors that ended it. Within weeks of Mary's death, the England she had fought to build began to vanish. Elizabeth moved swiftly. Catholic bishops were removed from their positions. Protestant clergy, exiled during Mary's reign, returned home to enthusiastic welcomes. The religious settlement that Mary had enforced through law and fire was systematically dismantled. Parliament passed acts re-establishing Protestant supremacy. The break with Rome, which Mary had temporarily healed, became permanent and irreversible. It happened so quickly that it seemed England had only been waiting for Mary to die before revealing its true loyalties. The Catholic restoration, which she believed was her divine mission, collapsed within months. 5 years of work undone in a matter of weeks. And the reason it collapsed so easily was that she had no heir to continue it, no son to inherit her convictions, no daughter to carry forward her vision. The biological failure of her body became the theological failure of her reign. History has not been kind to Mary Tudor. She's remembered primarily through a nickname, Bloody Mary, that reduces her entire existence to the religious persecutions she ordered. Nearly 300 Protestants burned at the stake during her reign, their deaths recorded and amplified by Protestant martyrologies that shaped English memory for centuries. The burnings became her legacy, overshadowing everything else she attempted or endured. But the medical evidence reveals a different story beneath the religious violence. Not a cruel tyrant, but a woman whose body had been at war with itself since adolescence, who lived in chronic pain that no doctor could explain or relieve, who suffered the particular cruelty of phantom pregnancies that convinced her body and mind of children that didn't exist. The tumors growing inside her, whether in her brain, her ovaries, or both, didn't just cause physical agony. They stole her future. They took away the one thing that might have secured everything she worked for: a child, an heir, continuity. Modern medicine can look back and see the mechanisms clearly. A pituitary tumor disrupting her hormones, flooding her system with prolactin, convincing her body to prepare for babies that would never come. Ovarian masses swelling with fluid or cancerous cells, creating the visible pregnancy that gave false hope to an entire kingdom. Multiple conditions converging in the worst possible combination, untreatable by Tudor medicine, fatal by the time she reached her early 40s. She wanted to be remembered as the queen who saved Catholic England. Instead, she's remembered for burning heretics and dying without heirs. The medical tragedy of her life, the 27 years of undiagnosed, untreated disease, gets footnotes in history books, if it's mentioned at all. But perhaps that's the most haunting part of her story. Mary Tudor didn't just fail to produce an heir. Her body actively, cruelly mimicked the process twice, raising hopes and then crushing them with humiliating finality. What she believed were royal babies growing inside her were actually the tumors killing her. The kicks she felt weren't infant limbs stretching. The swelling wasn't pregnancy. The lactation wasn't preparation for motherhood. It was disease masquerading as life, death wearing the mask of creation. And because of that biological deception, because microscopic cells in her brain and ovaries grew in patterns that destroyed her fertility and eventually her life, England became permanently Protestant. The religious map of Europe was redrawn. Centuries of history pivoted on the failure of one woman's reproductive system. Mary Tudor died believing she had failed her faith, her country, and her God. What she didn't know, what she couldn't know, was that her body had failed her first. The autopsy that was never performed left the mystery unsolved. The truth was buried with her in Westminster Abbey, sealed away from examination, protected by tradition and time. All that remains are theories built on fragments, medical speculation constructed from 500-year-old symptoms, and the undeniable fact that something inside, Mary Tudor, mimicked royal babies while actually destroying a queen and changing a kingdom forever.